Okay,
Yes.
good. So, hello. Oh, is there an echo? Oh, on my side? Okay, that's probably just because I'm in a closed room. So hopefully you can still hear me well enough. And when I'm muting myself, that shouldn't be a problem anymore. Hello, everyone. My name is, oh, thank you, Vienna. My name is Roy Schulman. I'll be your chair for the day. Judging with me are Rafi and Grace. My preferred pronoun is he or they. I'll let the panel introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Rafi, also he or they. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Grace. She or they, please.
Welcome everyone to the EUDC 2020 partial double quarters. A round of applause by people at home, I presume, which are probably better able to applause than just the 11 of us. So let's introduce our teams. In opening government, we have Vienna A. In opening opposition, we have Durham A. In closing government, we have Leiden C. And in closing opposition, we have LSE C. The motion before the House is this House would ban insurance of sexual misconduct claims or something very much along those lines. I do not have the wording right in front of me. And without any further ado, we would be very happy to welcome the Prime Minister for, oh, sorry, I'll take a speaker who's speaking first beforehand. So starting on with OG, who is speaking first.
English speaking first, no preference in terms of gender pronouns and history.
Miri speaking second, she or they, please.
Okay. Good. Ingo, your net seems to be not great, so you might want to do something about it. At least for me, I heard you a bit off. Yeah, so it seems it was for other people as well. So see if you can do something about that. Moving on to opening opposition.
George speaking first, here they, please.
And Hannah speaking second, she or they, please.
Good. Moving on to closing government.
Kat speaking first, she please.
Louis second, here they.
Good. And finally on closing opposition.
Hi, my name is Mingxuan. I'm going first, no preference. My partner just dropped out the call. I think his internet is having connections. Could we wait 2 minutes for him?
Oh, yeah, then definitely we'll wait for him. That
yeah,
would be
he's coming back on. Yeah.
Okay. While we're waiting, could any of the volunteers be able to write in chat in the 1, 6, and 7 minute mark?
Yep. I believe he's back.
Oh, he's back. Oh, yeah, there, I see him. Good. So you're speaking first, and that means that Murtaza is speaking second.
Yeah. Both no preference. Thank you.
Good, thank you. So I believe Now we can finally welcome the Prime Minister to start the debate that stands in his name.
Just quickly checking if I'm audible now. I'm speaking from Miri's device.
Yeah, that's a lot better.
Good. Okay, in that case, I'm going to set up my timer. Panel, we believe the largest problem currently facing us in regards to this motion is the notion that that people are simply making a mistake when committing sexual misconduct. We believe that is what insurances are for, and the notion that people are just making a sort of an honest mistake is a large problem that we want to solve on our side of the house. 4 points. Therefore, first of all, what insurance we think is for and why it is not for this. Secondly, just definition-wise, what kinds of things are we talking about? Then 2 points of substantive. Firstly, why the vast majority of claims are going to be well-founded claims, and secondly, why the imbalance of power is a massive problem in this debate otherwise. Okay, first point, therefore. We say that the point of insurance is essentially to enable you to do your job. That is to say a couple of things. A, you can, we want you to be able to do your job without having to fear external circumstances that are largely outside of your control. That is to say, you're making a mistake, but it's sort of an understandable mistake. That's why you're being insured. For example, we have car insurance, not in order to encourage you to drive recklessly, but rather to cover you in case you or other people make a mistake. Beyond this, we say sometimes you don't have all the answers, you don't have the entire overview over the big picture. Sometimes you're simply unable, for reasons roughly outside of your control, to correctly assess a situation. That is to say, as a result of unforeseen circumstances, you do commit a mistake, although you have been trying to do your best, be that in cars, as a doctor, in a hospital, these sorts of things. So we want you to be able to do your job without having to fear your own mistakes. So what we are going to do is we are going to ban these kinds of insurance products for sexual misconduct claims. Second point, what kind of things are we talking about? We think this is a wide range of things, such as harassment, intimidation, discrimination, all the way to actual sexual assault. We think all of that is covered in the motion. We think the problem is that today there's just, given the entire Me Too movement that we have experienced, everything that has happened in the past couple of years, there's just no room for you to claim, oh, I didn't realize that I was being wrong. I didn't realize that this was inappropriate. We think you know that these kinds of conducts are wrong. You know what you're doing. It's not outside of your control. It is within the range of your control. Okay. Third point, and moving really more into the substantive, we think in the vast majority, the claims regarding these highly inappropriate behavior are going to be basically well-founded. That means A, they are well-founded in the sense that the cases are usually rely on pretty much established and rather clear facts. We think in many cases, when the claim is made, these people have like the people that make the claim, the victims, already have to consider all the pushback that they are going to get. We think largely these claims are going to be well thought through and based on well-established claims. B, we tell you these claims are unlikely to be made because of a one-off thing. That is to say, if a person that is generally accommodating to women, because mostly the victims are going to be women, then makes a one-off comment that is inappropriate, we don't think that people are necessarily, because of that one comment, going to make a claim. Rather, we think that this is because a person has created an uncomfortable environment for women, or at least for one woman persistently, and therefore that is persistent behavior. C, we tell you there's no reason why creating an unsafe environment was outside of your control. We think there are two ways in which this is inside the control of the perpetrator. One, we think oftentimes it's just them directly themselves creating an unsafe, uncomfortable environment. Or secondly, we think they're enabling this kind of environment. If you're, say, the CEO of a company, you know that these things are going on in the office and you look the other way, you don't care. Those are problems that we have. At this point, if closing has any POI, I'd be very happy to take them. No? Okay. Opening?
What is the burden that a victim has to prove in court?
Right. So essentially, look, again, we say that the court cases are usually going to be well established, but the point is less about court cases, but about banning insurancy products. So we don't see how this is really at the core of the debate. Second point of substantive why the imbalance of power is a massive problem. A couple of things here. We think the imbalance of power, because usually these perpetrators, e.g. Harvey Weinstein, e.g. Brett Kavanaugh, are the more powerful player compared to the victim. That allows them, to avoid consequences. That is to say a couple of things. One, it is usually hard to get a better lawyer than they do. It is usually, secondly, easy for them to intimidate you because they are more powerful, because you rely on them, maybe even because you look up to them. And thirdly, because they have their people to cover their tracks. It's relatively easy because of the power imbalance within a company, for instance, for them to have other people lie for them, cover their tracks. In terms of the imbalance of power, we tell you it is also something that you're with the insurance allowed to get away with without really any consequences, because the insurance is covering it. So if you're rich enough, you probably don't care. And if you're powerful enough, that means further, it also doesn't massively damage your reputation often, because you keep your reputation, you keep your power. We tell you this leads to massive damage to the victim. Why? Because the victim usually can't really speak out. Those are women who need the job, who want a promotion, who maybe look up to that person, who depend on the perpetrator. We think that also leads to massive psychological pressure, because they need the job. They wonder, should I speak out? Their only way to access is if we remove this insurance coverage. Thank you. Very proud to propose.
We thank the speaker very much and very happy to call on the leader of the opposition here.
Am I audible? Great.
Yes.
I'll be starting in 3, 2, 1. Panel, I want to start by clarifying what this insurance money is to be used for, because I don't think OG actually do that, right? This money is to cover the cost of legal proceedings, whether it's civil proceedings or criminal proceedings, depending on how the victim pursues this. This is about like paying for your lawyer to speak in front of a judge. It's about your legal costs and potentially the victim's legal costs as well, if you are convicted, right? Yes, I completely agree that people should pay if they're found to be guilty or if the civil judge like leans in the victim's favor. But I think that happens in other ways, right? If they're convicted like Harvey Weinstein, they go to prison. If they're forced to pay like £1 million settlement, that is not covered by the insurance. Like the insurance is primarily about the proceedings themselves and the cost of actually going to court, right? I think there are also private ways, such as firing from the companies, like has been happening, right? I think what happens in OG is that they say, look, these people should be punished and they therefore should pay for the legal costs from start to finish. But this is like a massive amount most of the time. And note that in many cases, like they are not convicted yet, which means that they are not necessarily guilty. And secondly, it stands in the way of justice. It stands in the way of a judge listening to them. And I think that is awful. We'll see more about that in our second point, which is about how people are principally entitled to insurance. But first, I want to talk about how victims become more discredited on their side and are heard less. No, thank you, right? Because I think that's the most important thing in this debate, right? Because for too long, victims of sexual misconduct have been gaslit by their abusers who don't want to pay any costs, who just say, well, we're just like, this never happened, and they just keep denying it. Note also that OG is just wrong. It's incredibly hard to convict sexual misconduct cases, right? Because you have like old male judges primarily. You have a really, really high burden of proof. Note that you need to be proven guilty beyond reasonable doubt, which is like really hard when your testimony just relies on hearsay on both sides, because it's mostly a he said, she said, and all other victims tend to work at the same, all other witnesses, tend to work at the same company. They tend to have incentives to keep their mouth shut. Also note that the law generally is outdated when it comes to convicting sexual misconduct cases. I would say change that before you go about taking like defense mechanisms for people who are on trial, right? I think because it's so hard to convict, right? For victims, it's incredibly important to get acceptance by their abusers that this, yes, did happen, or yes, this is a credible accusation, and potentially an apology. I would say that is much more meaningful, and closure that they get out as a result is important for moving on. I think that is so much more important than being stuck in endless legal proceedings that are most likely not going to end in the victim's favor. How does this become less likely on their side of the house? 3 reasons. Firstly, note, if the accused feels that they can't cover their own legal costs because they don't want to spend their own money, or they don't have that money, right? They don't want this to go to trial. They don't want to have to pay for legal proceedings. What happens there? They deny it publicly. They deny it a lot. They deny it to people who will be potential witnesses, who are potentially their employees and don't want to testify against them anyway, right? They also intimidate the victim, whether it's through their lawyers or themselves on social media by trying to reach out to them. I think they tell the victim, shut up, this never happened, don't go to court with this. Why is this really, really bad, right? Because it's likely to be successful, because there's already things keeping the victim from speaking up, whether it's the massive stigma you get when you speak up about sexual misconduct cases, or whether it's the fact that you're forced to recount a really, really uncomfortable experience in your life, or just the fact that the accused is probably someone who's in a position of power over you, meaning they probably still have some power, whether it's over you or other people in the industry you want to succeed and work in. I think it's already really hard for victims to speak up. I think even small intimidation makes it so much harder. And at the point at which you give an incentive to people who have committed sexual misconduct to intimidate more, because they know that they'll have to pay out of their own pocket for whatever outcome, I think that becomes so much worse. On our side, they're more likely to just go, okay, let's settle this, because they're not paying. They want to get it over with. And they know that the courts are probably on their side otherwise anyway, which is a really sad fact, right? Secondly, I think there's a massive backlash happening to the Me Too movement, which again, I just want to say because it's being streamed is absolutely fucked, right? But it doesn't change the fact that there are like some men who feel like this is, I don't know, PC gone mad or whatever other fucked up idea they have, right? What this means is that now they don't only see it as like women discrediting men and taking them down from positions of power, they also see the state as actively taking away their power to defend themselves. They're like actively taking away mechanisms they have to ensure that they get a due process, right? Because this is also likely to be sensationalized by, I don't know, Fox News, who already hate the Me Too movement. And like, it doesn't matter if these men can cover it themselves, right? This is about the principle of it and how these like people who commit backlash see it. What this leads is to more doxing of victims, more abuse to them online, bad comments, meaning not only that these victims are intimidated, but also that future victims feel less comfortable to speak out because they've seen what's happened to others. It effectively reverses the trend of the Me Too movement. Thirdly, I think this applies in wider context as well. I think it applies, for example, to entire companies, right? Who are like led primarily by male execs and don't want to be in that position. They don't want to have to pay for any of that, right? I think what this means is they become less proactive, again, reversing the trend of the Me Too movement when it comes to help allowing people to express the fact that there's been sexual misconduct committed against them. It means they don't ensure that they have a diverse human resources department where people can feel comfortable speaking up. They ensure that they don't have anonymous complaints procedures and other policies that are oh so important when it comes to victims speaking up. I think on Gov's side, victims are just forced to shut up, and that is fucking reprehensible. I think we're winning this debate. I'll take CG now if you have a point.
This motion is about insuring claims. What that means is that if you claim, you're going to court against the insurance company. That is what this motion is about, not about insuring legal proceeding costs, which is an entirely different thing.
Okay, thank you. I'm not like sure at all what you're saying. All I know is that what insurance means, as you can see in the Ask CA chat on Discord, right, is that when you go to court and like pay for lawyers, you pay for like all the legal costs, right? That is covered by insurance on our side. On your side, the people who go to court pay out of pocket, like the accused, right? Now moving on to the principle, right? Because I think these people are principally entitled to insurance because, as Soji says, this is about situations outside your control. Note that it's not about harm caused to the victims, right? Because if I drive my car and kill 5 pedestrians, insurance will still cover that, right? Even though I've caused massive harm. I would say, even though whether or not you've committed the misconduct is not outside your control, obviously, what is outside your control is the accusation, right? Because I think these people may be innocent. And even though I think it's great that we've like taken a stance as society and take powerful men down when they do bad things, I think the law itself should uphold the principle of innocent until proven guilty, upon which it is based, right? And I think the legal costs just ensure that people are able to do that. Two things here. Firstly, yeah, innocent until proven guilty. That was actually the first thing. But secondly, I think because of cancel culture and the fact that society is likely to turn against these people, perhaps rightfully so anyway, it's even more important that they get a fair hearing and a fair shot at trial, like especially because they're likely to lose their salary and have even less money. I think on our side, we uphold everyone's rights and also make sure that because you get better trials, victims also have a better chance to speak out and perhaps get the conviction that they deserve when these people are guilty. Very, very proud to oppose. Thank you.
Thank the speaker very much, and very happy to call on the Deputy Prime Minister. By the way, if you see me eating during this speech, I assure you that this is for the benefit of everyone that I would be able to. Okay, Deputy Prime Minister.
I can empathize with needing food, so no worries. Panel, I will spend a solid part of my speech on clarifying what kind of cases would or would not be covered in the Delta, how the society looks at these cases in the status quo, and why OO is uncomparative. Sadly, they're right, but they're uncomparative, so out of this debate. And lastly, I will talk about Ingo's case and the principle of culpability, and why, if we allow perpetrators of sexual misconduct to keep filing these away as mistakes, even when they get caught, even when there is indisputable evidence that they are guilty, that just makes it so much incredibly harder to fight these cases in society. Now, let's look at what opening opposition tells us, right? Because all of their analysis on male execs don't want to pay for that, so they don't encourage HR to speak up, and like, you know, it's very hard to convict sexual misconduct cases because your boss or whoever is in charge has massive power over you. They're trying to intimidate you. They're threatening to fire you. Those are things that Inga already tells you. That is the problem already in the status quo. It is already incredibly hard for a woman to come forward. If this changes in 10 years, then maybe we will reconsider what kind of claims we cover under insurance. But I don't think, panel, that right now we need to be worried about poor males that may be accused unfairly, right? One, because just because Donald Trump says this happens, I am unsure why that means it is true. Like, I can genuinely not think of any case where it has been proven that it has been true. I can think of many cases where we have a lot of evidence to believe that those men were being terrible to women, but there wasn't sufficient evidence, so they were not convicted. There is already the biggest chilling effect that you can possibly have on women because everything you see around you points to that, right? If you see Brett Kavanaugh on the hearing for the Supreme Court, where it is very, very clear for anyone with a fucking brain who wants to listen that that person probably committed a lot worse things than drinking a beer, and that person was still confirmed on the Supreme Court of the United States, I don't think that the fact that women might think they don't win the case is something that is comparative. Second, notice that insurances already have a lot of incentives to try to get out of paying claims as much as possible, right? If you accidentally run over 4 people, yes, your insurance will cover it. But if you are a terrorist who does that on purpose, no one will cover that under your insurance, right? Very similarly, there are many cases in which maybe should be covered by insurance because they may not be your fault, but the insurance obviously doesn't want to cover it, so they try to get out of it, right? So I am unsure why in the status quo, any woman that brings forward a case against sexual misconduct and loses it, has it covered by insurance. I think the vast majority of them already do not, simply because of the fact that they aren't able to prove it. I don't think that opening opposition can prove a meaningful delta in the amount of cases that will come forward, right? And like saying that there is backlash to Me Too because some men feel that political correctness has gone mad, I am unsure why that is comparative. I am unsure why that is something that we should care about. Moreover, I think that the backlash of against Me Too is supported at the moment at which we have a lot of other counter narratives in society that support the idea that sexual misconduct can be a mistake, that if a man commits it, maybe he's a good man and maybe we shouldn't punish him. Maybe we should care about ruining his life, because it's very easy to spin the narrative into that, regardless on which side of the house you are. Panel, what we are doing in opening government is we are shifting the narrative on the victim. We are telling you that if a woman is bringing forward a case of sexual misconduct, it's probably not because her very nice boss, who has always treated her respectfully, made a drunk comment once that he thought was a joke, but she didn't see as a joke. Because no sane person would risk losing their job and being called a liar and being dragged through the mud for something like that, right? We believe that the vast majority of sexual misconduct case, and in all cases, the sexual misconduct cases brought by women that don't have power and wealth behind them anyway, so that for them it really doesn't matter if insurance covers them or not, are going to be cases that are pretty obnoxious. There are going to be cases where women do not feel comfortable at their job. There are going to be cases where women are being sexualized at their job and they are unable to perform the job that they were hired to do and the job that they want to do, because they are being treated as a piece of meat, because we keep encouraging, like, because the fucking president of the United States keep encouraging that if you treat women in a professional environment as a piece of meat and someone who is there to please you aesthetically, that is something that is like locker room banter and something that is okay. If a man does that, it was just a mistake. He's still a good man. Oh, look, there's one woman over there he didn't treat terrible. He can't be terrible to women, right? Panel, I think that at the point at which sexual misconduct claims are being covered by insurance, and I actually think quite a few settlements are covered by insurance, can be covered by insurance. Definitely, they are going to be covered by the insurances that very powerful executives have. I think those are in the debate, and I do think they are meaningful, right? But notice that OO themselves tell you it's not about whether the man can afford to pay it or not. It's about the principle. And bingo, that is exactly what we are telling you. We don't necessarily care if it's a massive financial harm for Harvey Weinstein that he has to pay some fines or has to pay some court, like some lawyer fees or whatever. What we are saying is that at the point at which insurance covers it, we are putting it into the same pool as unexpected circumstances or as honest mistakes. We do not believe that is acceptable, panel, and we do not believe that is something that should be allowed to stand. I will be looking at issue of culpability and why it is undisputably not the case. But before that, closing, do you have a POI? I tried. OO. Okay. So I don't think that I think the issue of culpability is really meaningful when insurances decide what they pay out and what they don't. I think that there is no room for claiming that sexual misconduct, and especially sexual misconduct claims that have actually, been filed formally and being made public and led to consequences, because that is the only moment at which this debate steps in and starts changing something. I don't think saying I didn't know any better can keep being an excuse for sexual misconduct, right? One, because there's an incredible amount of information available, as Ingo has told you. We live in the 21st century, post-Me Too. But also secondly, because all of these things are codified into law, like not discriminating, not harassing someone, not bullying someone, not belittling someone, not making someone feel unsafe, are all codified into law, and the laws don't care whether you know they are there or not. You still have to respect them. But also secondly, the burden to educate can no longer be placed on the victim. If you bully someone, we judge the harm you caused, not if you realize you weren't being funny. The power asymmetry makes everything worse. Ingo has already explained to you all of that, and OO bought into it, so I assume it stands in the debate. Panel, we need to stop insurance companies from paying out sexual misconduct claims. Please propose.
We thank the speaker very much. Very happy to call on the deputy leader of the opposition here.
Hi, can everyone hear me?
Yes.
Great. Panel, I want to start by rebutting the case from opening government and then moving on to their responses to us and weighing our case. They say firstly that insurance creates the idea that it is an honest mistake and that that's a really bad thing. Firstly, I just think that this premise is wrong because I don't think that circumstances outside of your control necessarily mean that you've made a mistake. For example, your car insurance will pay out even if it was your fault that you didn't check in your back wing mirror before you reversed out. That is still something that probably wasn't an honest mistake because you should have been doing that in order to legally drive, but the insurance will still pay out. So I think it's rather that it was something that just happened, and like I don't think that necessarily means that it's an honest mistake. But secondly, I just think that at the point at which there could be even just 0.1% of people who are accused who could be innocent, and the most important thing is the principle of justice, whereby you are innocent until proven guilty. I think that at the point at which you start eroding this principle, justice just doesn't seem fair. And that's the delta in this debate, is the backlash that George speaks to you about how there is going to be much worse backlash towards the victims and towards the Me Too movement at the point at which this can be proven as like negating the principle of innocent until proven guilty. But secondly, I just think at the point at which you start eroding this principle in some areas of law, that's a really dangerous precedent, because then it's just more likely that you start to erode it in other areas of law, and that will probably also harm really vulnerable people regardless. Secondly, they say, well, these claims will be well founded. I don't think that just because a claim is true means that it has a lot of evidence behind it. I want to contest that assertion, because I think that the burden is huge. It's beyond reasonable doubt in criminal courts, meaning that you are just unlikely to be successful because you need evidence, not just one word against another. But why this is so important is because the more time that passes, the less evidence you have as a victim, and therefore the less likely you are to get a conviction. So the point at which not everyone is fucking Harvey Weinstein who can afford to cover their legal fees, the point at which instead of putting the burden of paying legal fees onto the private sector, the insurance, which will like provide these these lawyers faster, you have to go to state provided lawyers. That means that the case will be delayed for potentially years because of the fact there is a massive backlog of state provided lawyers. And at that point, as a victim, you are so much less likely to get a conviction because now you don't have the right types of evidence. And like the lawyers are the ones who tell you what kind of evidence you need in court. So you don't actually gather this evidence in the first place unless you are already in those legal proceedings with your own lawyers, because I don't think you can pay to have lawyers like a year in advance of the time when your court case actually goes to court in order to make sure you have the right evidence. So at that point, I think they just make it so much less likely that any victims get justice. Then thirdly, they make this weird assertion that it's not about whether this goes to court or not. I think just firstly, if you're not provided with lawyers for free, then you are going to do much more to try and stop the trial, because even if you are wealthy, you still don't want to lose some of the capital which you have as an individual. What I think this looks like is more character assassinations and intimidation, particularly at the lower end, where there is less like press coverage, because the person who you're going against is not Harvey Weinstein, which means you probably just have less like media support for you, and it's much more difficult. So I think that like it's much worse on their side. But secondly, even if it doesn't go to trial, I think you still probably get more positive benefits for the victims, at the point at which the insurance will still pay for a settlement out of court. The alternative is that person might have to pay out of their own pocket, which means the victim is probably still likely to get less money from that settlement in the first place if it doesn't go to court. And so I think it's probably just better on average that the victim gets more money paid out to them. So what were their responses to George's case? Firstly, they say, well, you can go to court, like you can still go to court regardless of insurance. I think that firstly, it's just not true. It's about whether it happened. But also I think that like the person, if they are convicted in court, still has to pay out the cash settlement at the end. Like if it is a successful court case, that individual will still have to pay $1 million. I think that at that point, there is not a significant harm to them, like they're having their legal fees covered, if it means that people at the lower end of the spectrum, i.e. people who aren't convicting massive celebrities, just get more justice overall. But also I think that even if it's true, I think the alternative is just an increased harassment because they don't want to pay, but also it's just less likely to go to court because of all the things you said about backlog and got absolutely no response to in relation to state lawyers. Then they say, well, we're really uncomparative because intimidation and burdens exist regardless. No, what we explain is that the delta is so much worse on their side for 5 reasons. Firstly, because you have more incentives to intimidate. Secondly, because you are just less likely to be successful when you have less evidence. Thirdly, because it's easier to discredit victims when this case comes at a later date, i.e. it's easier to say, well, why didn't you come forward sooner? Even if the reason you didn't come forward sooner was because you were waiting for a backlog in the state provided lawyers for the defendant. So I think that you probably just still get more backlash on that side of the house. Fourthly, because I think that you just don't get to court for cases which aren't super high profile. And that's like, these women are still just as important as the women who are going against Harvey Weinstein. But finally, I just think that the likelihood of them being guilty is probably irrelevant, because the very optics of the nature that now it's no longer innocent until proven guilty just creates more opposition. And that's bad, even if it's like not true, even if it's not true and they are guilty, because it just means that less victims come forward in the future. I think that's a massive delta on our side of the debate, where when there is more and more backlash in the media, future victims don't come forward. And then all of the progress that we've made in the Me Too movement, where victims feel like they are able to come forward, just goes back, and we go back to this culture of secrecy, which means that less and less victims come forward. That's a really, really harmful impact in this debate. I'll take a PY from closing.
This is not about criminal cases. You cannot insure yourself from going to prison. This is about companies insuring themselves civilly to make sure that they don't have to pay out settlements, or when they lose the court case, they claim.
Yeah, so like, you don't have to go to court to have the insurance pay the settlement towards the individual outside of court. I think that as a victim, you are more likely to get a higher payment outside of court, which is probably where you're most likely to get a chance of success in the first place, at the point at which, like, it's an insurance who is going to take the footfall rather than the company itself, because they have an incentive to ensure that the stuff they pay out is as low as possible. But also, I think that it just does cover cases which don't even have to be trivial, but seminal cases where you're still trying to get money for the victim, not from the company, but rather from the individual who committed the misconduct claims. And so at that point, I think it is still important that you don't have this backlog, because everyone has to have representation. And so at that point, they will still just be provided with a state lawyer on the counterfactual. And that creates so much more of a backlog. And I think that that is a really negative thing, because they can't just assert that everyone can afford to pay for a lawyer, because the majority are not Harvey Weinsteins. So why do we bring the most important impacts in this debate? Firstly, because I think we make it more likely that cases go to court, which has the most benefit for the victims, because they get catharsis from sharing their story. But also secondly, because they're more likely to get emotional support from charities to help them recover from trauma. And thirdly, because there's probably less incentive for intimidation from the offender and other right-wing society. So I think we also minimize the effects on future victims as well. And secondly, because the principle of innocent until guilty is probably the most important impact for the offender, because they should be principally allowed insurance because it could be their fault. The burden on Gov's side is to explain why people who may have caused like a car accident before should no longer be allowed to have car insurance, or employers shouldn't be allowed to get insurance against their employees. I think they never proved this. We explain why women get more settlements and insurance has a harmful effect on narratives. So proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker very much, and very happy to call on the closing government, the member of government here.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you. 3, 2, 1. 1 point of framing, then 1 point of extraneous response, then our exception. We think this is primarily about companies. One, because rich dudes, I think, are primarily awash in this debate, because shock horror, they can pay out settlements, they can pay for their own lawyers. Oftentimes they have their own law degrees, but more significantly, they are probably fine. They can continue to be managing all of this themselves with or without insurance. We think secondly, it's primarily just not about individuals, because most individuals assume their own innocence, don't assume that anyone around them will accuse them of sexual misconduct at random, and they are also oftentimes just not sued for compensation, which in countries that don't have as crazy of a law system as the US is oftentimes the big part of this, right? Like most of the time, the actual settlement is the thing that really is incredibly expensive, and that is the thing that is primarily insured against. But also additionally, I think this is like primarily something where individuals are more concerned about potential criminal penalty than they are about the possibility of a civil case, because most individuals aren't necessarily even aware that they might also be sued for compensation. They're more scared of going to prison if this happens, or being otherwise penalized, against which, as we point out in the POI, you cannot insure. We think this is primarily about companies doing this as sort of a cost of doing business, because they know that at some point, one of their employees is going to harass another employee, and they just want to make sure that at that point, they won't be paying out a huge sum of money for having failed to do something about it, for having failed to have a functioning HR department, for having failed to fire that person after they did this for the 4th time and kept victimizing their younger employees. 1, extraneous response to opening opposition because this is fucking offensive. Look, I think the idea that you do not you do not try with everything you have to stop someone from going to court against you on a sexual assault charge is fucking ridiculous. I understand they can say 5 mechanisms, but if those 5 mechanisms are proving something fucking ridiculous and they are not proving anything, right? Because at the point where you're already at 100% incentive to prevent this for your reputation, because you don't want to be considered as someone who did something that is morally abhorrent, specifically in the Me Too era, where at the point where you are even accused of this, oftentimes you are considered guilty by a lot of people, oftentimes correctly, which means this is something you want to avoid. Like, maybe there's some additional incentives now, but they don't prove that you're not already at 100% fucking incentive, right? So I don't think we have a case. Let's talk about insurance companies and why it's always worse to go up against them in court. Why will you be up against the insurance company in court at the point where these claims are able to be insured? One, because it's usually a part of the contract that the company that against which you are making a claim has with their insurer, because it is something where the insurer usually wants to check the claim that is now against them, wants to use everything they have in order to minimize it, to minimize the payout that they actually have to give. See, opening opposition says, oh no, insurance just wants to give you a preemptive settlement. Like, note that that's bullshit, right? Because they know that if they go to court with the fact that they have in-house lawyers that are specialized on making sure the claim is as small as possible, and you have in-house investigators who are making sure that every single thing has been considered to minimize the effect of this on them. I think it's just ridiculous they don't want to go to court. They will want to make, but even if they don't want to go to court, right, they'll still use all those resources preemptively to make your settlement as small as possible. So like, this is just fucking bullshit. Like, note that they want to also make sure that the company doesn't fuck this up, right? Because many of the companies that they are insuring for don't have as good a legal department, which means the final settlement might be very high, which means the insurance company would then have to pay out more. That is why they want to be there themselves, so they can do it better. Why are they able to be awful, and how do they do it? I think insurance companies specifically are the ones who are significantly more able to drag your name through the mud, to harass you by bringing up every single thing you did wrong in your life or that was socially unacceptable to make a judge dislike you, by making sure that they can dig up every inconsistency in the victim's memory, even if it's not about the assault, but about something else, by harassing you around your testimony again and again with a lawyer that has great expertise in making sure they're fucking amazing and intimidating people and making them cry in court and look bad. Why are companies or even individuals, if opening opposition were correct, which, like, let's be real, they never prove, much less able to do this when they are themselves the ones in court? One, companies are significantly more image conscious in terms of wanting to make sure that they don't look like they are making their female employee, cry in court and being absolutely awful to her. Because they know, because companies need to continue to have customers, and they also are just names that are much more known. Name for me an insurance company, please. Most of us probably off the top of our head can maybe name one, and it's the one that we get our health insurance from. Most of us cannot name an insurance company. However, other companies are much more brand and image conscious, specifically in the Me Too era, where there's a culture around not being associated with this kind of behavior, where it's a really fucking bad look. Secondly, a size and expertise. So even if you don't buy this, note that companies exist in just like a variety of different sizes. Oftentimes, they do not have a legal department, and would have to hire a separate lawyer outside of house. That lawyer may not be optimal. Compare this to insurance companies, which are specialized in this, which have presumably trained their lawyers to be really fucking good at making sure that the claim is small. Compare this to insurance companies, which oftentimes due to economies of scale, because you can use the same lawyer and the same in-house investigators to investigate multiple claims, have an incredibly high ability to do so. But also note that they profit specifically if they are as harsh as absolutely fucking possible. This is their only incentive because they have no other need. One, because if the case is shorter, it is also cheaper for them, which means they want to harass the victim until they fucking give up. Secondly, they want to make the settlement lower because they have a fixed income, namely the fees that are paid to the yearly or whatever in terms of insurance fees, but the only movable cost that enables them to make a profit is what they need to do is minimize payouts that are given. Note that specifically, what the situation they are in on this means that they also look much more profitable to shareholders if they are as harsh as possible, if they make it impossible for suits to be won against them. That is possibly the other method of raising income. I think that this is specifically why they have no reason not to be harsh, because the people that they care about liking them, namely shareholders who care about profitability, will like it if they are trash to victims. Let's talk quickly about prevention and why it's likelier to happen within companies on our side of the house. Because note that at the point where you can no longer insure against a claim, and it is cannot make it a part of your predictable cost of doing business, but rather you just have a perpetual risk of a business ending payout hanging over your head if you don't do something. These small, spaced out costs of prevention trainings, of ensuring that there is a functioning HR department, becomes a much better choice, because that's never going to kill your business. That's predictable. You can plan for that. You can make sure that you allocate your profits in that way. You cannot do that at the point where possibly the outcome of a suit could be like half your yearly income. I think that is something that otherwise does not happen at the point where you can just more easily insure it in a way that doesn't cause as much disruption to your business. But it's also massively more viable now, because your shareholders know that this is the reason you're doing this, because you don't have another option, because it is economically smart. Panel, I think making this in the interest of companies is incredibly important. But moreover, insurance companies are fucking horrible to victims. Please propose.
Thank you, Speaker, very much, and very happy to call on the member of opposition here.
Yeah, sorry, let me get my timer. Panel, closing opposition has one simple extension. We will explain why sexual misconduct insurance help to reduce the power asymmetries for victims and the ability for them to come out, directly clashing with many of the GAF claims to begin with. But before that, I just want to make two notes, one on OG and one on CG. First, on OG. I think OG cannot win this debate because they have to prove that insurance claims become the tipping point of which power asymmetries increase drastically. So while they give a good characterization of why status quo is already bad for victims and wield a lot of power, they don't specifically prove that there will be less victims coming out as a result directly from the insurance and not because of existing power structures. So at the end of the day, opening government has no delta in this debate. Secondly, on closing government. Closing government's claim relies on the premise that insurance companies are the ones choosing your lawyers and actively fighting the legal battles for you. Besides the fact that that's blatantly false, because insurance company literally, the way it works is that you choose your own lawyer because of things like lawyer-client confidentiality, for instance. Insurance company cannot also possibly have the capacity to care about every single instance of which a claim is being issued to them. And we're talking about things like in-house investigators, for instance, that's probably a good thing because they investigate for things like insurance fraud, which means to say that individuals who undertake this insurance cannot take part in things like moral hazard, for instance, where they're buying this insurance because they know they're taking part in like sexual misconduct behavior often to begin with. And also, insurance companies just don't care about whether you win the court case or not, because a lot of these is already factored into their risk algorithm when they issued you this insurance to begin with. Because if you make a claim, you pay higher premiums anyway. And the last thing that closing government talks about is this idea of harassment of victims. Besides the fact that this is completely illegal, there's no incentive for insurance companies to do that because insurance companies relies on the image of trust. And to the extent that that is true, anything that you do to damage your reputation in a way, for example, victim harassment, is probably a bad model for insurance companies. It is for those reasons we don't think closing gov can win this debate. Let's talk about why we reduce the power asymmetries for victims and their ability to come out. We will present to you three mechanisms. The first of which is why we strengthen the support for the Me Too movement. Opening opposition said that there are some individuals who need fair trials, sounding like a team of men sympathizers. We deviate from that. What we say is that in the few rare but possible cases where men are found not guilty and because on the basis of fraudulent claims, because while rare, they exist, the problem is these cases are landmarked in a way like, for example, Johnny Depp is, and becomes lightning rods and therefore garners sympathizers of which men of which they can garner support for the fact that men are targeted without cause and things like that. Note that while the Me Too movement has gained a lot of traction, one of the biggest problems that they have and one of the biggest roadblocks they have is that they need to reduce the hate and the perception that the movement has become vindicative. The core criticism against the movement is that they are cutthroat and they go up for men and specifically on the basis of fraudulent claims. What if we need to disprove that? At the very least, what this insurance policy allows us to do is to provide them a safeguard to ensure that like cases like completely bankrupting a man does not occur, so that this generates enough buy-in into the movement. Particularly, this is able to increase support from the movement, particularly among moderate men who feel as though they might be one day victims of this fraudulent claim. or even though they are necessarily already leaning towards sympathizing for the movement. This is important because if we change the incentive for them from being reluctant to be supportive of the Me Too movement to one that is more supportive, they are also the people who are going to do things like, for instance, vote for more legislation that allows for greater protections of sexual minorities, or for example, change the corporate cultures, especially if we acknowledge that a lot of men are in positions of power, such as your HR directors, for instance. The second mechanism we bring you is that why we specifically change the corporate culture at a point at which companies are allowed to insure themselves against misconduct claims for two reasons. The first of which is that the first response from HR departments at a point that an individual comes out to them with a sexual misconduct claim is always to deny it, is always to ignore it, and always to take part in cover-ups. And the reason for that is because they never ever want these cases to go to court, and they want to maintain a veneer of plausible deniability. This is different from what the OO claims about how like individuals will try to resist going to courts because court orders are issued, right? But this is talking about how the HR department as a whole refuses to engage with people who come up to them and make a complaint against someone within their company. The difference, therefore, is that now companies take these complaints with a lot more weight and a lot more seriousness because they know that number one, is good for them in terms of their credibility as a company. But number two, then they're shielded from the fact that they need to pay the cost. Shareholders, for instance, are much more amenable to making changes on a corporate level because they know that they don't have to bear the cost of going to court from their own pockets. But secondly, the first argument about why they're buying for men into the Me Too movement is also very important because it translates into change on a corporate level, of which most sexual misconduct claims are happening to begin with. So there's broad-based support that we get. But the last thing here, before I move on to the last thing in this claim, I'll take opening government if you have a claim.
You don't prove a delta in either incentives to cover up or the harm on victims if they lose. We don't need to prove your delta. We just need to prove they're terrible and we shouldn't keep piling on bad things just because we can't remove all of them.
No, so you need to prove that the piling on of bad things is a significant change because absent of that, the current power structures exist. What we prove is that we are able to reduce current incentives that make up and form the existing power structures that made it so difficult for victims to come out. So the delta that we get in terms of benefits is much bigger than the marginal harm you get of like maybe men, particularly rich men, paying slightly less for their court fees. So let's talk about why this changes corporate culture on the third level. The reason for this is if companies can make individuals within their companies and ensure that they have insurance policies, they're much more likely to be less defensive of male executives within their companies because they know that they are already insured, and therefore they're less likely to dismiss the fact. The last mechanism I want to talk about is why victims get more compensation, because we agree that not all cases happen on rich men only. There are also very small instances where there are disgusting men who are not as rich, but the problem therefore is victims never get the appropriate compensation because they are already bankrupted from the fact that they are like paying the court fees. The insurance allows court fees to be paid by the insurance companies and additional compensation to be paid for the victim. This is great for the victim because they get the compensation they deserve. It is for all these reasons that we are very, very proud to oppose.
We thank the speaker very much and very happy to call on the government whip here.
Am I audible? Ladies and gentlemen, even if you don't buy anything we said about whether sort of insurance companies are doing this, etc., we still had a lot of mechanisms on how we can prevent these things from occurring. I think that's probably one of the most important things in this debate. That's because there's a lot of things that companies can do. They can create places for claims and complaints where you can easily and securely file your complaint. They can give information, hold evenings, and make sure people feel comfortable. They can have more women. They can have only glass doors. They can do a lot of things to prevent these things from occurring. Even if now they have an incentive to do so because A, They know that that means that they can spread out the cost instead of having one huge potential cost at one moment where you know there's a risk to the company of becoming bankrupt, and all your competitors are doing it, and it's easier to explain that to your shareholders. We can have these preventative measures. This is something that Kat explains and gets no response to. Even if you don't buy anything else from our extension, I think this is more important than opening government's principle that this is not a mistake. I think this is more important than opposition's entire idea about backlash, because that's going to happen anyway. This is the thing which means that less women get harassed. That is extremely important and should already win this debate. Look, I'm happy I'm a law student because that means that I know the actual context of this debate, but I can also explain why this is true. Because this is like in every scenario, it's always insurance companies going to court. Every time you read a court case, it's insurance companies. That's because if I drive a car and I drive against someone else, and we both made a mistake, it is not us who are doing the legal proceedings, but it is the insurance companies who are doing the legal proceedings. We don't care because we don't have to pay for the damages, right? Why would I go to a legal proceeding if I don't have to pay the damages? And that's exactly what is going to happen here. You are going to have insurance companies doing these claims. So, and like everybody who has ever had to claim anything from insurance knows that insurance companies are not easy and not willing to pay out. So they're willing to make sure that the person who makes this claim does not succeed, right? CG has two responses, which are both factually untrue, but also don't make sense. So they firstly say they cannot pick your lawyer because there's a lawyer and client confidentiality. Firstly, they pick their own lawyer because they're doing their own court case. But secondly, even if this was true, like it doesn't matter because lawyer confidentiality means that you are just not saying anything that was like discussed in that discussion, and it doesn't matter who picks that lawyer, right? Otherwise, state lawyers also couldn't exist. Then they say insurance companies really don't care about how much they have to pay. Like, look, like Rafi, this is literally something that you answered in a question. They will have to pay that settlement. They will have to pay that fine. They will have to pay whatever the damage is that happens in court. That means that they want to make sure that they don't have to pay as much. That's why they all have specialized like legal departments to make sure that the claims is lower. That means that they will fight you in court. They will fight you in dispositions where there's evidence collection like pre-trial. That means that they will make sure that you have the least chance to succeed. Kat gave structural and comparative analysis why they're better in companies, and that is extremely important. I want to talk about firstly what I care about in this debate. What I don't care about this debate, because there's quite a lot, and then what I care about. Firstly, on CEO, moderate men who get really angry because Johnny Depp has to pay. Firstly, they need to prove that this is about individuals. Kat didn't prove that it's not about individuals, therefore this doesn't apply. Secondly, I have no idea whether Johnny Depp has insurance. I have no idea whether Harvey Weinstein has insurance. Nobody knows, so it really doesn't matter. So thirdly, moderate men will also don't like it when they have to pay higher insurance premiums if they have to pay more. So if it's really about money, that also happens on their side of the house. Fourthly, this is also obviously a reputational harm, so you also don't want to pay that. So I don't think that moderate men are going to change their behavior because there's insurance. What do I also not care about? Backlash in society, which I actually think is the same as CEO, because there will always be backlash, because you're seen as the accusing person regardless. The right-wing media will always frame you as a bad person. As OG tells you, it gets very little response. No response, actually. And secondly, the impact that they claim is that you're less likely to go to court. If we prove that it's easier to go to court and easier to win, then we obviously win from this, because I don't think the backlash delta is going to be huge, right? What I also don't care about is OG's principle that it is not a mistake or maybe some narrative change, that it's a deliberate action. What we want is that victims get the money they deserve. What we want is that they're more likely to go to court. What we want is that there's an active deterrence from making these complaints. What we want is that it's not a horrible experience to go to court if you are a victim. That is what we want. That's what you should care about. Care about these victims. Why are you more likely to win, to go to court, not have a horrible experience on our side of the house? But before I do, I want something from OL.
stated in Ello and CEO repeated, if more men turn against the Me Too movement because media frames it as state passing policy to take away men's right to defend themselves, this makes it harder for future victims to come forward, making any other outcomes.
Okay. So one, this is not about individuals, it's about companies who can defend themselves. So this doesn't matter. Secondly, there's always a state lawyer, so you can always defend yourself. Thirdly, this is not about poor men because this usually happens quite high up in companies, so they have money for lawyers, maybe one or two. I don't think the moderate men are going to change their behavior on that. So, and all of the other analysis and rebuttal that I've already given. Why you're more likely to win? Insurance companies are one, big by nature, so they have extremely big lawyer departments because they need to be able to hold, have huge cash reserves and have a lot of claims. Companies are big by nature. You have small companies, you have big companies. Some of them are better at worse. Secondly, they're more specialized. They're more able and willing to drill you and to make sure that the money is that the payment, the settlement is lower, which companies don't always have an incentive because they have a counter incentive because they don't necessarily want best press. Companies are less able to make sure that women have a horrible experience. Also, they are less willing to do that. Insurance companies really don't care. They don't give a shit. It will be a horrible experience. Therefore, vote CG.
We thank the government whip, and last but not least, very happy to call on the opposition whip.
I just want to make sure this is not being streamed.
Everything so far was streamed. Do you want your speech to not be streamed?
Yes.
Okay. Could we log off the stream? Ojan? Ojan? Ojan, are you with us? It seems that that Ojan, that as far as I know, is responsible for the streaming, is maybe not here at the moment. So let's see if we can get someone else. Rafi, could you get in touch with someone relevant from the people?
Yes, I'll put a message in the group. Thanks.
Okay, so we'll just wait for that a few seconds.
Okay, the stream should be turned off in a few seconds.